Madam Speaker, a CBC story last week listed the 10 top U.S. imports from Canada in 2023. It totaled $340 billion. Oil, gas, and petroleum products made $160 billion of that, which is 48%. Ag products, $30 billion, 10%. Ag products depend a lot on the oil and gas and petroleum products when you're talking about fertilizer and machinery. And then transportation equipment, $74 billion, 25%. Transportation equipment, that's steel, metal, all sorts of things made from the resource sector. So a tremendous amount of exports to a country that's looking for self-sufficiency in North America, and that comes from Canada. A lot of it comes from Canada, our exports. We're over 50%. Does the U.S. have a cap on emissions, a cap on oil and gas production now? No. Has the President-elect indicated he would put an emissions cap on oil and gas production? No. He's looking to expand their oil and gas production, and he's looking for more from his biggest trading partner in oil, gas, Canada. That's why we need a North American energy security. But the cap would cause 1 million barrel per day reduction in oil production by 2030, with an additional 1 million barrel per day cut by 2035. This cap on oil emissions is a cap on responsible Canadian oil production and jobs and paychecks. In Alberta, we're talking 92,000 jobs reductions. We're talking $12 billion government revenue lost. The Conference Board of Canada think tank estimates the cap would reduce Canada's GDP by $1 trillion by 2030. That's $1 trillion. That's a loss of 151,000 jobs across Canada by 2030, and slowing the GDP by 2030 from 15.3 to 14.3. Deloitte estimates Alberta will see 3.6 less than investment, 4.5% decrease in the province's economic output. But also Ontario would lose 15,000 jobs and $2.3 billion from its economy. Quebec would even lose thousands of jobs. I know my colleagues across the way have often talked about other forms of energy production. Well, solar and wind. I have the largest ones in Canada in my riding is solar and wind. And they were complaining about the Premier putting a moratorium. Well, they did a 6-month review. In one of the reviews it said, you don't build them on irrigated land, which is a lot in my riding because that's for crops. But yet I still have the largest ones in Canada in my riding. But the other day at 7 o'clock in the morning, no sunlight rays hitting solar, no wind moving, not one iota of power was coming out of solar or wind that morning. 7 o'clock in the morning, nothing. What didn't supply it? Natural gas was supplying the energy we need in Alberta. And the products it takes to make solar and wind, we're talking about steel, we're talking about aluminum, we're talking about plastics. All those things to make solar and wind come from the resource industry, other than glass. Now, here's an interesting thing about glass. It takes sand. It takes a specific kind of sand. National Geographic reports that China is destroying estuaries all over the world as mining companies now get that best small round sand to make glass, not the stuff in the deserts, it's rough. So from the National Geographic research, thank you.
Terry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I believe that the question originated as talking about carbon pricing, but I'm really happy if we're going to talk about the cap on emissions from oil and gas instead. I mean, I'd like to begin by starting with the point that emissions in Canada are on their way down. That's a good thing. And when we first formed government, emissions were tracking upwards, and there was no path to bringing those down. Now, today, we sit in a place where our emissions are lower than they had been in almost 3 decades. That's real progress. And that's what our young people want to see from us and our next generations, because they know that if we don't take action on climate change, that we're going to see more and more natural disasters, and that we are going to also lose the economic opportunities that we have here in our country to provide the energy and to provide that know-how and to provide that innovation that we are creating right here. And in fact, we see this time and time again, that we are developing that important know-how. If you want to look at examples, Madam Speaker, of how we're working on supporting great energy projects right here in our country, you only need to look no further than the Oneida Battery Project that's with 6 nations, not far from Toronto. It's kind of in southern Ontario. It will be one of the largest battery projects in all of North America. And that was created with the help from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, from the federal government, making sure that we're working in partnership. It's a question of reconciliation, but it's also about how do we create that battery storage for the days that the member opposite was bringing, where maybe there's less sun, less wind. Well, you know what? There's battery storage. We do have those other solutions, and the world is looking for these other energy solutions. That's why we worked with Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia to develop an offshore wind industry. We've created the changes in the Atlantic Accords to be able to make that happen. That's what they were looking for from us. So time and time again, we're working to make sure that Canada's placed at the forefront in fighting climate change, that we actually are on track to meet our targets. And we are, by the way, on track to meet our interim targets for 2026. The oil and gas cap emission cap, that will actually help us to be on track to meet our further targets. We need to take these actions. We need to do it for our economy. We need to do it for our planet.
The honourable member for Bow River.
And thank you to my colleague who I've worked with before and appreciate what she has stated. And I will talk specifically about carbon tax and the sugar beet industry in Canada. We now have one place left in Canada that refines sugar. We need sugar. It's a growing industry in our country. But in Ontario, what do? They grow sugar beet, about 10,000 tons. They truck them to Michigan. Where's the carbon tax sense in that? It's an industry we have in southern Alberta, but the carbon tax for that producer is getting so expensive to grow, to truck, to have it done as it should be, so we retain this part of our industry in Canada. It's important, but the carbon tax makes it so difficult for us to compete on the world market, and that's an industry we need in southern Alberta. That's an industry we need for Canada, and carbon tax, it threatens it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
How sweet that I get to talk about sugar for a second, because right in downtown Toronto, we have Redpath Sugar. I got to go to Redpath Sugar and to look at the improvements that are being made with federal support from Agriculture Canada to help them to actually reduce their energy costs and energy needs so that they're more efficient. It actually is helping them on their bottom line. It was also helping with making it a safer environment for their workers. So yes, even with sugar, we're making improvements while actually fighting climate change.